Good day, everyone, and welcome to Unstructured Data is Costing You More Than You Think, hosted by Valora Technologies. My name is Elise Titosian, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. We are pleased to have with us Sandra Serkes, President and CEO of Valora Technologies, and Dr. Eugenia Brumm, of Director in HBR Consulting Information Governance Group. And we are going to talk about the high cost of finding information and how to fix it. So Sandra and Eugenia, I'll hand it over to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Elise. We're delighted to have everybody today, and we will be going through a lot of information, and we also have some time for Q&A, so we encourage your questions. Okay. Oh, and thank you, Eugenia, for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Before we really dive into this subject matter, we're going to play a little game to kind of set the tone for everybody. If you're old enough to remember War Games with Matthew Broderick, this is a screenshot from that movie. All right, Elise, can you get your stopwatch ready? And I'll ask everybody out in the audience to do a little bit of math. If you know me, you know I'm going to make you do math. So we are going to figure out what each of us costs our organization every minute of the day, and that minute could be spent productively doing work, or it could be spent somewhat less productively hunting around for information. And since that's the theme of this webinar, it's very important that we figure out what that number is. So this is how you do it. You don't have to share this with anyone. It's for each of you to understand, sort of your personal worth. But follow these instructions starting with your annual salary. Do this math, and you will come out with a number of what you are worth every minute. So that we can all share a common number, I took, let's just say, a $50,000 salary, and at that salary level, you are effectively worth 52 cents every minute to your organization. So if you don't want to do your own numbers, we can certainly use this one. Okay, now that you know your net worth, let's get ready to play our game. Elise, if you have your stopwatch handy, that'll be good.
I do.
Excellent, thank you. And I'll tell everybody your goal is to simply look at a picture that I'm going to display and find the green belt. Ready, set,
Ready.
Go. Okay, so this is a picture that looks strikingly like my daughter's bedroom, even though it is not actually. It might as well be. And I promise all of you there actually is a green belt somewhere in this picture. It's in plain sight, and it usually takes people about 30 seconds or more to try and find it. This is our big metaphor for content and sort of how it's kind of stored across a modern day organization. It really is a little bit like a 16-year-old's bedroom with things, glommed all over the place in no real order. And when it comes time to find something, it can be incredibly difficult and painful, and as you'll soon see, expensive. So Elise, if nobody comes forward and says, I found it, please stop us at the 30-second mark and we'll give it away.
Okay, so we actually, while you were talking, 56 seconds passed.
Oh, wow, okay. All right.
And nobody found it, I found it, but nobody else did.
Yeah, well, you know.
I know where it is, though.
So we'll give it away to everybody now. We'll call it roughly a minute and say good enough. So here's the green belt tucked in underneath this yellow sweater or whatever it is. So there it was. It was in plain view. And it's pretty hard to find like this. Kudos to anybody that did find it. Compare this picture to this one. Okay? This is the exact same amount of stuff. It's the exact same set of clothing, except organized and stored neatly. And if I ask you now to find the green belt, it takes you a split second to find it. And that is the difference in having categorized and classified information and not. And so we wanted to kind of put this out to you to say, this is a real world, we've all lived it kind of example of what content classification really is, and then also now to link that back to the costs of having to live in the world on the left versus the costs of living in the world on the right, essentially setting you all up for a return on investment or cost justification to go through the effort of going from here to here. So let's take a look at that math again. What was the cost of your inability to find that green belt? And you can use that, again, that green belt metaphor for anything that you're hunting for throughout a day. That email you can't find in your inbox, because if you're like me, you have 56,000 emails in there. That file that you know is somewhere out on the network, but you know you wrote it or your colleague wrote it 3 years ago, so God only knows what folder it's in. This is what we're simulating with trying to find the green belt. So now take out those calculations you did and let's see what it really did cost. Okay, if you were that $50,000 worker, remember that your cost is 52 cents per minute. Let's say it took you a minute and a half. You just cost $1.56 just to find that one thing once. Like if you're like most of us, did you ask your colleague, hey, where do we store such and such, or where did you put whatever? Now there's both of you. Now you have to double that number. Did you give up and just recreate that content because it was just too much trouble to find? What did that cost? Now you have a metric for essentially analyzing your value per minute, and you can just figure out how many minutes things are taking you to do. You will quickly cost justify an auto classification system. So let's get into the metrics, and this is where Eugenia is really going to shine, because she's done so much research and has an extensive sort of background in analyzing this type of stuff. So Eugenia, I'm going to leave it with you.
Okay, thank you, Sandy. Let's look at that first bullet point. These statistics that we're going to be looking at are pretty sad when you stop to take a look at them. Why is it that today, with all of the tools and all of the technology that we have available to us, that it's taking an engineer a longer amount of time to find information? Isn't that what these tools were supposed to do, was to enable us to be more productive, to increase our efficiency in the organization? There isn't any one reason. There are several reasons for this. But let's go to the next bullet points and see what they have. The next three all lead to the same conclusion. It takes us an awfully long time to find stuff when we need to look for it. The statistics are fairly standard and the same across the board. It looks like 1 day a week at minimum is what employees and you and me and everyone else is spending trying to find information. Why does this happen? We'll take a look at that in a few slides as we talk more about technology, and Sandy points out a few things about the offerings that Valora has. But it's hard to see the information. You put it here, you put it there. It was actually easier if you start to think about it in the paper world, because you can open up a drawer, you can look in your desk, you can actually see words. You can't do that with electronic information unless you open up the document itself, and there you've wasted time because you don't have the right document, so you're opening up one after another. Okay. So again, that next bullet point confirms that. Two hours a day searching for information, which is 10 hours a week, which is more than 1 day. So you're not working during that time. Middle managers claim that they can find the information, 59% of 1,000 middle managers, which is a substantial number. So again, this statistic has been proven out again and again. 6.5 hours a day spent not working. Think of that. We have meetings, we conduct business in the hall, we have our emails that we're trying to respond to, and this is not work. Where is the part that we need to actually contribute to the organization? 6.5 hours a day leaves us with 1.5 hours left to work. No wonder we're working on weekends. Work doesn't begin until we find the information. And somehow people think it's part of my job every day to look for stuff. When did that become the norm? Okay, knowledge workers spending from 15 to 35% of their time, again, searching for information. You can see by the citations here that it isn't just one organization that has come across this and found this to be true. Spending more time recreating existing information, you know, this can be very, very expensive depending upon the kind of information, the volume of it, the importance of it to the organization. And only 21% of respondents said that they found the information they needed 85 to 100% of the time. And again, as Sandy mentioned, people go to all kinds of tactics to try to find what they need. They'll look here, they'll look there, they'll go talk to somebody. They'll search, again, the same directory, the same file because they think they've missed it. So all of that time is spent not working and not contributing and not providing value to the organization.
I'd like to just point out, if anybody out there is trying to make the case to their senior management or to the CFO about the cost structure, take a look at that bottom line there, $16,000 per person. That's just an astounding number if you add that up across all the employees in your organization. It makes any kind of system look frighteningly cheap.
And in fact, the cost in recreating, I have an actual scenario that I can describe here. I was in an organization where they had conducted a very expensive market research study on the viability of selling their products in China. They paid almost $500,000 for that study. It was not viable at that time because of the conditions in the country, but a few years later, not more than 3 years later, conditions changed and they thought, oh gosh, let's resurrect that. Here's a huge profit area for us. No one could locate the study. The person who was responsible for it had left the organization. They think he might have had a copy of it in his garage, but they weren't sure about that. So they had to redo that study.
Oh my God.
$450,000 is a tremendous amount of money, but also the time and the cost spent redoing that when those people could have been doing something else. So it's the opportunity cost as well that's lost. This is very, very hard. This is what's really hard, trying to find all of the information that resides in various places in the organization, especially if you're trying to pull together structured and unstructured. It's hard enough to find structured if you have good systems, but then the unstructured is in such chaos, and trying to combine that into meaningful information so that you can work with it, you can make decisions, you can move forward. And a lot of it is really because of technology, because we have so many places today. We have so many tools. We have stuff, as Sandy mentioned, we use our email, Outlook as a file cabinet. We have stuff in there. We have stuff in SharePoint. We have stuff on content management systems. We have stuff on hard drives. We have stuff on thumb drives. Information is just all over the place. Trying to pull it together. In addition to that, you're thinking, where did I put it? Where did I put it when I created it? The second thing, the big thing, what did I name it? A year later, it may not make sense to you. You were thinking about it in a different way at the time that you put it in that place and at the time you named it. So information, we all know, and we're probably preaching to the choir, it's scattered all over the organization. No one really knows where it all is given a specific subject or topic. This real-world example really floored me, but it shouldn't have, because I've been in the field for so many years, and I saw this happen in even the paper world when I started to do actual studies of how much time it was taking people to find stuff in file cabinets, and that was alarming in and of itself. Today it's become even worse. This was an R&D group in an organization. These are scientists. Many of them have dual degrees of MD and Ph.D. So highly paid individuals, highly intelligent, wanting to be productive. Average annual salary, and this includes the admin as well, $130,000, including the benefits. The time that they spent looking for information and not finding it was costing the organization $6 to $11 million a year. And this did not include, as I said, opportunity costs, what they should be doing in order to move the organization forward. What is the cost of reworking and recreating the information that we mentioned in the earlier slide? Cost of reworking, because it can't be found, was an additional $4,250,000 a year. So 15% of the time spent in duplicating information that already existed. The cost is staggering, and this is very puzzling to me as to why organizations continue to call this soft costs. And one of the reasons is because there are no metrics. Cannot measure the increase in creativity and original thinking. Think of creativity unleashed. Think of the opportunities for innovation. If you're frustrated and you're running around and you're trying to respond to something or trying to find something that you need in order to complete the task at hand, you certainly don't have a clear mind. You certainly aren't looking and thinking outside the box to provide opportunities for the organization to actually progress in creating new wealth. There is no metric that you can use to compare a good decision to a bad one. How do you know that the decision you made was good without the information or partial information when you actually made that decision? How do you know that the project has taken twice as long? You don't know. These are items that are very real, that happen on a daily basis in organizations, and a lot has to do with the fact that the information is not at hand when that project has to be completed or when that project is being worked on. What's happened is we are living, and we have been, in an information age since, I think, the 70s, defined as information age, no longer in the industrial age, maybe even earlier than that. But the measures of productivity that are being used are still based on production. They're still based on the assembly line and input and output and assets versus liabilities. And there is nothing that captures and measures the effort, the work, the lost opportunity, the amount of time that could be spent doing other things in an organization that organizations are writing off and not even realizing it, not even knowing about it. I think that if you don't measure it, you don't know what's actually happening. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So by ignoring it and calling it soft costs, I think organizations are missing a huge opportunity.
And so that brings us kind of to where we are now, which I will politely call the sea of information. These are some real-world examples from certainly Valora customers, but they could be reflective of pretty much any organization out there. We are kind of swimming in a world known as ROT, which stands for sort of redundancy, obsolescence, and trash. And that's just the useless stuff. That's all the actually helpful, useful data nuggets that are embedded amongst the rot. And that is the kind of unstructured, unknown world where we are. Fortunately, technology kind of got us into this mess. Technology can get us out of this mess. Trying to do things manually, file by file, document by document, those days are pretty well over. Even if we all set to work creating information about all our files, also known as metadata, even if we all did that all day, every day, the information would outpace our ability to do that, just the speed at which it's being created. So we have to look for technological solutions that honestly can operate at a rate faster and in many ways more consistently than human beings can. And that gives rise to this whole notion of what I call DDC, or sometimes even, this is an older slide, I'll call DDCF, which is document, data, content, and file convergence. These are all coming together broadly under the umbrella of information governance, because there's both a need to get things under control as well as a need to kind of orchestrate the usage of information past and going forward. And so this whole school of thought is starting to now have new tools, new best practices, and ways for dealing with information in the aggregate as opposed to kind of siloed. Interestingly, although they've somewhat been laggards, the legal industry not always thought of as being kind of technologically advanced, the corporate legal is really taking control of this arena. The risk and exposure have basically reached epic proportions with all the data breaches and the threats of the same, that corporate legal really has to rise to prominence in managing the company's assets, which today may very often be information and nothing else. We are a knowledge-based society. And fortunately, the training that they've had in, like, let's say, the last 10, 15 years in e-discovery have set them up well to understand large populations of documents. Just the routine efforts of kind of organizing, classifying, and culling down documents for legal use, for litigation, is a very good backdrop for doing that in the larger picture of information governance. And that's why you see some overlap between those areas. We're also seeing kind of what I call the rise of the records manager, where the RIM folks really, they're so used to dealing with records, they understand how to classify and organize information, and now they're being brought into the legal realm, seeing more and more RIM groups reporting up through legal as opposed to IT, because of that overlap between the technical side and the information governance side. Very good role, I think, for forward-thinking records managers. And then finally, the cost structure of what essentially litigation and investigation, what those do to an organization when there's not proper information governance, can be devastating. And so there's a cost impetus to get this information under control as well. And so there are some emerging best practices. The notion of centralizing what in my alma mater they call CCMO, which is coordination and control of the management organization, is basically the idea that there needs to be centralized information management, some sort of umbrella organization like information governance, and to have policy-based management of information as opposed to ad hoc or worse, decentralized, where it's every man for themselves. And so the centralization of this lends itself nicely to automation of this effort. And the kind of the top of the automation stack would be auto classification. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. It's taking away the effort of that manual metadata creation and letting systems do it automatically, also in the background without having to impede people's workflow. They often are taking place silently, quietly, without affecting what we call processing in place. You're going to hear more and more of that this year. That's the ability to provide metadata and useful information about files without impacting anyone's ability to use or find those files. So the tool, of course, that we use here at Valora is called Powerhouse, and you'll see a little bit of that in action in the rest of this presentation. Elise, maybe I should stop and see if there are any questions so far before we dive further in.
Yes, thanks, Sandy. Actually, I have a few here, if we can take the time to address them. So the first one is for both of you. Which department in an organization should take ownership of an IG policy?
I will support what Sandy has said about legal. Usually compliance has emerged as a new leader in this arena. Compliance is usually slash legal slash compliance. So that area is the one that is emerging, and I think it's a good place for information governance to actually reside in an organization. Sandy?
I would very much agree with that, Eugenia. Although I also see sometimes if for whatever reason legal is, let's say, busy or would rather hand that off to somebody else, the other place where I'm seeing this kind of gain traction is in the CIO's office. And that's a little bit different than, managing IT. It's really stressing the I in the CIO title, information. So sometimes we're seeing the kind of the ownership or the impetus to take control happening there as well as legal.
Yeah, I agree with Sandy, because I've worked with a couple of organizations now where the CIO was really the impetus to get that function moving in an organization.
And I think that's, in some ways you could sort of flip that question on its head and say, basically, whose tush is on the line if there's a problem? Certainly legal, but definitely the CIO. If you're looking for almost a single point to yell at, it's going to be the CIO, and I think that they've recognized that and have taken steps to prevent that from happening. So, okay, Elise?
Okay, then I have another one here. What are common errors made by organizations in their first attempt at data remediation projects, and how can these errors be avoided?
Okay, for data remediation, we use that term as well for paper and electronic. And I think if we take a look at the question and perhaps rephrase it differently, what should be done before you consider data remediation? And having come from a background of records and information management / information governance, we always say set the policies in place, develop the rules so that you can have defensible disposition with your data remediation to make sure that you are deleting, expunging, shredding, destroying information that, one, has rules according to retention so that you're not guilty of what's called spoliation. So setting that in place first, understanding that, and then looking at what legal holds are in effect and pulling that information out of the mix of that to be expunged or destroyed.
I would add to that a mistake that we have seen some groups do is this notion of leaving IT out of the mix and saying, you know, this is really a legal function or this is really a records function and it's just about data cleanup. There's no need for IT. And the reason that I would say you want to get IT involved is because it's going to involve some kind of software. It's going to involve some kind of movement of information around the enterprise, and that really is IT's domain. They will have things to say about that records and legal people tend not to think about. Like we have an XYZ protocol about the movement of data, you know, at such and such time of day, you know, things that people just would never think of. And so to have them involved in the conversation early is pretty key. Even though maybe they don't even want to be there, they kind of have to be. Somebody from IT should be there. So. Maybe one more, Elise?
And how has the revisions to Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, the FRCP, affected evolving IG policies?
I think that the biggest impact of the rules changes has been the most recent rules changes, which are all about proportionality in litigation. In other words, I always think of it as let the punishment fit the crime, and what I mean by that is let the kind of document management solution fit the severity of the matter. And what that has done, this notion of proportionality, what that really means is that it doesn't have to be crazy when you're having litigation. Things that are really outside the scope or the effort to produce or evaluate is too great, then there can be some leniency. And that same idea of proportionality is beginning to trickle back up into information governance because there has to be some sort of notion of what do we really need to keep everything forever? No, we can have realistic retention policies. We can hopefully find tools and techniques to enact those policies, and that lends to a sort of proportionality notion in the management of information in general so that it can carry right through at the time of litigation. So I kind of see a little bit of the tail wagging the dog there. All right, why don't we plow through a little more, and we'll stop later for more questions, so keep those coming. Let's understand, I've mentioned auto classification a couple of times. Let's understand that in detail. Basically what that is software. It is software that's been kind of pre-configured with special algorithms that do recognition. So they're recognizing first and foremost the type of document. What do we mean by that? Well, it will recognize a letter written from a supplier to a customer. It will recognize a cash flow statement or a motion in limine. There are lots and lots of typical business documents that most organizations have. And then there are also unique ones that belong to specific organizations, and that's where some of the custom configuration comes in. But basically, these algorithms recognize the type of document and then all the content and all the little kind of meaty data nuggets inside of that content. When I use metadata, I don't necessarily mean the kind that comes along for the ride because Microsoft Windows will tell you the last modified date. That is a type of metadata, but it's kind of file metadata. there's a big difference between file metadata and content metadata. And that's really the arena of information governance, to understand what does this document say and what does it contain. So auto-classification is essentially a middleware that sits between the documents wherever they might live throughout an organization. Maybe they're on an email server, maybe they're floating around in your inbox, maybe they're just sitting out in, the H drive. But it sits between those locations of data and the uses of data. So what's a use of data? Various types of applications, sending out an email, maybe just doing a search. And so that's what we mean by middleware. And the big thing about auto-classification, why there's so much of kind of a push right now to utilize it, is it does not rely on people to have to sit there and create their own metadata, which most document management systems or ECM systems to date did require. They essentially required people, when you were creating a document, once you hit save or send, to go in and put in 5 or 6 fields of metadata, which is a royal pain in the butt. And most people either got away with not doing it or kind of cheating their way out by just saying XXX all the way across and calling it a day to get the screen to disappear. That ultimately is not real helpful for classifying content, and so using automation to do it takes the onus off of the people and also allows for way more than a handful of metadata fields. Several hundred of fields can easily be created. That has a lot of ramifications down the line when you're trying to organize that content.
Sandy, I'd like to add to that as well.
Sure.
When what are called electronic records management software applications emerged on the market a number of years ago, that was one of the huge drawbacks, was people were required to enter metadata. And there were a significant amount of studies done as to why that was difficult and why it wasn't happening. And it came about that if a person has to spend more than 5 seconds entering metadata, it is not going to be done. So to your point, that is exactly what happens. People give up, and the stuff doesn't get organized because of that.
Excellent. I've written that down because I'm going to use that. Okay, so auto-classification really is the much better option if you're talking about large volumes of data. What's large? I usually tell people if you're talking about more than 5,000 pieces of content, it's large. If you're talking about 80 terabytes, well, yeah, obviously. But there are other reasons, too. There can be sensitive information that, you don't just want to hire a bunch of temps to sit there and classify information because it's sensitive and they shouldn't be seeing it. And there's also a cost reduction. There's no question that having software do something is going to be lower cost than requiring everyone in your organization to do it by hand. Remember those numbers from the beginning of this about how much it costs to do something every minute. Obviously, our engine is called Powerhouse. You'll see that in a minute. So metadata really is the magic link that organizes content and sets it up for different usage patterns. And I kind of describe that sometimes as the well-organized kitchen drawer, where you can find anything you need, and as soon as you look at it, it is absolutely obvious and intuitive where everything lives. That's good metadata, okay? And so when I'm trying to explain this to people, I'll often show this picture and I'll say, that's metadata, and they get it. One thing that you all should think about is it's not really critical anymore to have a single content storage area to be able to have this kind of organization of content. The sort of more old style of document management systems or enterprise content management systems require the data to be loaded into those systems. That's really no longer true. And just in time, as we're moving everything up into the cloud anyway, what you really need is that middleware layer. The data stays where it is, but the information becomes centralized, sort of essentially a metadata database. Okay, so how does this work? There's really 3 key steps that Powerhouse uses to auto-classify when it encounters a file that needs classification. So the first one is called processing. For those of you that are familiar with eDiscovery, it's fairly similar but a little richer. And going in and essentially taking a file from whatever format it was in to getting a text rendition of that file. So if it was a native file, we extract the text. If it's a scanned image, we use OCR to create a textual basis. The second step is essentially tagging and going through For those of you that know Valora's background in auto-coding, this is kind of auto-coding on steroids, where it is just going through and extracting out or creating rich metadata on hundreds and hundreds of fields of information about each piece of content. So going from text to really a database record, a metadata database record about the piece of content. And then finally, putting in what we call a rules engine or a disposition layer, where essentially the software is aware of what the document is. We got that from the second step. Now it's going to figure out what to do about it. Should it tag it as restricted because there's PII present? Should it say, oh, hey, this is past retention, and move it off to a quarantine area? Or should it say, yep, this is important critical content, it needs to be promoted to a new environment? There's lots of different things that can happen. And so that looks like this, where we're going from essentially a fielded data record to an actual disposition that may involve the literal movement of files from one location to another. One of the things that we often do here is move files into a folder taxonomy, which is essentially a structured hierarchical folder format based on content. Okay, so here's kind of an example of how that works. Let's say Powerhouse encounters an email. It could be embedded in your Exchange server, or it could be floating around on your hard drive, and it finds this email and it starts tagging. It says, oh, I've got an author. I can validate that and include some other interesting information about that author, like his role. He's a partner. That might be useful later on. The organization he's affiliated with, his cell phone, and so on and so forth. And so Powerhouse just kind of goes through and starts pulling out useful data and creating a metadata record about this content. So the metadata record is going to include things like the author is Stuart Trumbull, and there's a matter number mentioned here. There's also a matter name. It's also going to say there are affiliated documents with this email. There was an attachment, and that is what we call an attachment range, that these two organizations belong, these two files belong together in their organization. And so it's going to go through this tagging effort, collecting all those tags, storing them away in the database, and then run through the rules engine and say, aha, we're going to go ahead and call this rule as Psaro. We're going to classify it with that tag, and if we're going to be moving files, we're going to move it into the Psaro folder. So that's a little bit how that works. Here's another example that's just, not a communication, just a document, same idea. Going to go through and collect and collect and collect information so as to either just provide this for a search or for analysis, or to go ahead with that rules layer and provide a disposition.
In the library science and information science world, we used to do what's called assigned term indexing. Subject heading books were huge. They must have been 4 inches thick, and the same principle holds true here, where you have a term, you gather that information, and you put it in a hierarchical location, which was in a library. That's why we have hierarchical organizations of books and materials in libraries. So it's very similar with the author, with the date, with the type of material, a little bit of description about what that concerns, and so on. So if you take a look and have, for those of you who are old enough to remember library catalog cards, that was what the information was that appeared on that little card. So this is similar, but this is electronic and it's automatic. No one has to assign a term.
Okay, so where does auto-classification come up? There are quite a lot of use cases. I will be honest with you, the 3 I hear about all day, every day are migration. In other words, we need to move data from one thing to another thing. Either we have an obsolete system that's no longer supported, or that's it, we're moving it up to the cloud, or we're migrating to a newer version of something. Whenever data is moving, it is a good time to get it under control, pull out that rot, organize, classify. It's just kind of a siren call for auto-classification. Remediation, the same thing. When essentially people have acknowledged that there's a problem with the data that they have, either there's none, or it was done poorly, or as Eugenia mentioned, kind of, let's just say rushed, in an attempt to get through it quickly. And the other one that's hot on the list is, over on the right here, is this repository knowledge management. I think that organizations, particularly law firms, are realizing what a treasure trove they have of information in their historical documents, whether it's for bidding the next project that's like the other 16 you did, or it's working with a judge that you've encountered before. There's just tremendous knowledge stored away in our documents, and if we have the ability to go in and extract out hundreds of fields of metadata, why not use that in a proactive way to help drive decisions? That's really the information is an asset side of the equation, and I'm delighted to report to you all that that conversation is finally taking place. It's not all about risk anymore. Okay, so here is what the kind of whole picture looks like. Remember, Powerhouse as middleware. So it encounters files. There are a lot of different ways. There could be a drag and drop, not pictured here. Could be an email bounce. Some organizations have all incoming and outgoing email bounced to a classification engine, so nobody ever has to classify that manually. Or in what we call shared server pool, that could be your document server, your email server, or just a shared drive, where Powerhouse is polling that every, let's say, 5 seconds and saying what new content has been created that needs to be classified. And then once it goes through its motions, goes and either pushes it out to a hosted repository like you might find in litigation or an investigation, or kind of organizes everything into a beautiful folder taxonomy or into any of the various DMSs that you see below, and obviously there are plenty more. The other piece of this equation that often enters the picture is how do the rules stay current? How do they know what my current list of open cases are, and that, the blah, blah matter closed this morning? And again, because we're using technology to do this, technology speaks very nicely to other technology. And so it is also polling the conflicts database or the billing system or the HR system and saying, by the way, who's been terminated or who's been hired or what cases are open or closed based on this morning, so that your rules are always up to date. And in that sense, technology is going to have a major advantage over the human approach to this, because smart as we are, there's no way in these massive organizations we know the exact status of every personnel in the organization at every moment, whereas presumably the systems do, and so having the systems talk to each other is the best way to stay current. This is a little bit what a typical kind of auto-classification architecture will look like. As I said, there's a database layer on the bottom. That's where that metadata information lives. The actual files live wherever they live. There's Powerhouse sitting on top, and above that, what we call a presentation layer. This is, if there isn't a document management system or it's lacking, as some of them are, this is a wonderful way to see relationships among content, to help find, as I was asked yesterday, I'm looking for white-collar workers who've been terminated in Idaho. Very easy to do that with a presentation layer. Very tricky to do that in just a kind of flat folder structure. So I'll show you a little of that. We'll just do a hint of that today in the interest of time. This is if you really want to get into the guts. I'll just kind of put that up there for the advanced technical folk on the call. But this is a little bit what that kind of data visualization looks like. So things like dashboards that say, for example, show me a document population across time, or show me the most important wholesalers, that's what this is, wholesalers, who are mentioned in this content. And all of this is just a screenshot, but in reality you just kind of click and go. No need to construct ridiculous Boolean searches that are only into one data silo. When you set up the middleware paradigm, you're searching all content at the same time. There are relationships between content. In this case, we're sort of showing illicit activity against the location. And then, of course, a little bit more of it, once you kind of narrow down, you can step through that content, assuming you have permission to do so. Again, having a middleware model lets you take advantage of federated security down to the content level. So if people are not permitted access to XYZ content, they will not see it in their search. So there's a nice level of information governance taking place here at the content level. We're basically coming to the end, so before we go to our takeaways, Elise, are there some more questions?
I do have a question here, and it wasn't directed to anyone specifically, so I'm going to say for both of you to answer. With multiple locations, either corporate or law firm, how can an organization control and manage information to avoid risk and or privacy threats?
The big question on the table that it comes from that question is, when you say multiple locations, are we talking within the United States or beyond the U.S. borders? Because the answer is very different. When we're talking about multiple locations within the United States or within a single country for that matter, there is a fair amount of data sharing that is permitted, and there can be some economies of scale to combining data down to one location or possibly putting it all into the cloud, which is effectively one location. Barring that, then you have to have kind of multiple instances of this type of technology because they tend to need a direct link to the data to be able to classify them. Once we get into the cross-border scenario, that's a very different story. For those of you who are not well versed in the GDPR, I would suggest you kind of Google that. Because those are a set of regulations that are coming down in May of 2018 regarding storage, management, analysis of data in the EU and what will be permitted and not permitted. And that affects organizations even that are operating outside of the EU that just might have, let's say, EU visitors to a website. You are affected by GDPR.
I'd like to add to that. I think the question was phrased at the very beginning of the question, how to control and manage. You can't control and manage if you don't know what you have. And that's the basis of auto classification. First, to find out what it is that you have, then you can establish rules and protocols and procedures, policies to control and manage that information.
Any other questions, Elise?
Nope, that was the last one, Sandy.
Okay. Well, then we'll kind of come to our big takeaway. We had two big takeaways. If you take nothing else away from this hour of conversation, take these two things away, that it's really not just a searching game. It really is about content organization, and stop killing yourself searching for information. Auto classification will get you pretty far. And so there you go. You'll find it fast. Thanks to everybody who sat and listened. Thanks to those who asked questions. Here's a little bit about Valora, if you're not familiar with us. And then here is a little bit about HBR, if you're not familiar with HBR. And thanks to everybody.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you too, Eugenia, for joining us. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.